The sound of a champagne glass tapping against a microphone cut through the backyard chatter, and my father's voice followed right after, smooth and practiced. Before we toast, let's acknowledge the one child who never quite figured things out. And 30 people laughed, some politely, some too loudly, while I stood 3 feet away holding a tray of half-empty wine glasses, frozen in place as if I had been positioned there on purpose, like part of the catering staff instead of his daughter. And I remember thinking, not for the first time, that I should have expected this, because this is how it had always been, just never this public, never this deliberate, never with this many witnesses watching me shrink in real time under the string lights my mother insisted made everything look magazine-worthy. And for a second I actually scanned the crowd, stupidly hoping anyone would interrupt him, my mother maybe, or my sister Melissa, who stood right beside him in a cream dress. That probably cost more than my monthly rent, but no one moved, no one spoke, and that silence was louder than the laughter, heavier than his words, because it confirmed something I had been trying not to name for years, that I wasn't just overlooked in this family. I was positioned, assigned a role that made everyone else more comfortable, more impressive, more complete, and I was supposed to stay in that role, smiling, helpful, invisible. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, standing there with their wine glasses and polite smiles, was that I had already stopped playing that role long before that night. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. And that's the part that changes everything, because if you had asked me 3 years earlier who I was in this family, I would have given you the answer they taught me, the easy one, the quiet one, the one that didn't make anyone uncomfortable. I would have said I was the practical one, the flexible one, the one who helps out, the one who makes things easier for everyone else. But that night, standing there while my father turned me into a punchline at his own anniversary party, I realized something much sharper, something that didn't feel like sadness anymore but clarity. And clarity is dangerous when you've spent your whole life being told to stay small, because once you see the pattern you can't unsee it, and suddenly every moment starts lining up, every offhand comment, every decision, every time my needs were postponed or dismissed or quietly reassigned to someone else who mattered more. And you start to understand that it was never random, never accidental. It was structured, consistent, almost efficient in the way it reduced you to something useful but never valued. And I wish I could tell you that realization happened slowly, gently, like something you ease into, but it didn't. It hit all at once in the middle of that backyard under those lights, with my father still talking and people still laughing. And I remember gripping the edge of that tray just to keep my hand steady, because for the first time I wasn't thinking about how to fix the moment or smooth it over or make it less awkward for everyone else. I was thinking about what it would look like to walk away and never come back. And that thought didn't scare me the way it should have. It felt clean, almost inevitable, like something that had been building quietly for years finally reaching the surface. And if you're listening to this thinking that sounds extreme, that cutting off your own parents over one moment is too much, I would have agreed with you once. I would have said the same thing, but this wasn't one moment. It was the first time the truth was said out loud in front of everyone, and once that happens, you don't get to pretend anymore, and neither do they. And what happened 2 weeks after that night, what those same people saw with their own eyes, is the part they never saw coming, not from me, not from the daughter they thought they had already defined. I left before the cake was cut, before the speeches wrapped up, before anyone could pull me aside and say something that sounded like concern but felt like control. And I remember walking through the side gate instead of the front, because I did not want to pass by the tables again, did not want to see the same people who had just laughed pretending they had not. And when I got to my car, parked half a block away because the driveway was reserved for guests who mattered, I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel for a full minute without starting the engine, just breathing, just letting the silence settle in a way it never had before. Because for the first time it was not heavy, it was clear. And clarity does something strange to you. It removes the excuses you have been using to stay. It strips away the stories you tell yourself about why things will eventually get better if you just try harder. And as I drove away that night, past the house with the string lights still glowing and the music still playing faintly in the background, I realized I was not coming back, not tomorrow, not next week, not for holidays or birthdays or any carefully scheduled version of family that required me to shrink to fit into it. And that decision did not feel dramatic. It felt overdue, like paying off a debt I had been carrying since I was a kid. And the thing is, if you had met me back then, you would not have expected that from me. I was the one who stayed, the one who adjusted, the one who made things work, even when working meant sacrificing something small every single time, until those small things added up to something you could not ignore anymore. And it did not start with big moments. It never does. It started with things so subtle you could almost miss them, like birthdays where my cake was whatever was left after Melissa picked hers, or Christmas mornings where her gifts came wrapped in glossy paper with ribbons and mine were in plain boxes that my mother said were practical. Or the way my father introduced us to people, Melissa is our pride, he would say, and then after a pause, this is Wendy, she helps out, and people would nod, smile politely and move on, and I would stand there holding that label like it was something I had agreed to carry, and maybe I had, because when you grow up inside a system like that, you learn quickly which version of yourself keeps the peace, which version gets the least resistance, and for me that version was quiet, useful, reliable, the one who did not ask too many questions and did not expect too much in return. And for a long time I told myself that was enough, that being needed in small ways counted as being valued, but it does not really, it just keeps you in place, and somewhere along the way, without announcing it to anyone, I started changing, not outwardly, not in a way they would notice, but internally, in the way I spent my time, in the things I chose to build when no one was watching, because there is a point where you stop asking for a seat at the table and start building your own table somewhere else, and that shift did not happen overnight. It was quiet, methodical, almost invisible, just like I had always been, except this time invisibility worked in my favor because no one thought to look, no one thought to ask what I was doing with all those hours they assumed I had, because I was the one with the flexible schedule, the one who could always help, always show up, always be available. And while they saw availability, I saw opportunity, and I started using it, one late night at a time, one decision at a time, stacking something that did not rely on their approval, something that did not shrink me to fit into their expectations. And by the time that anniversary night came around, the version of me standing there holding that tray was not the same person they thought they were laughing at, not even close, but they had no way of knowing that yet, and that was the part that made everything that came next possible. The first thing I did the next morning was turn off my phone, not because I was afraid of what they would say, but because I already knew exactly how it would go. My mother would call first, her voice tight and controlled, asking why I left early as if the problem was my timing, not what happened. Then my father would follow, not to apologize but to reframe the night into something smaller, something harmless, something I was overreacting to, and if I picked up, I knew I would slip back into that role, the one where I explain myself, soften the edges, make it easier for them to stay exactly the same, so I did not give them that chance. I set the phone face down on my kitchen counter and let it buzz itself into silence while I made coffee in a mug that did not match anything else I owned, because I had bought it for myself without asking if it fit anyone else's standards. And that might sound small, but those small choices had been adding up for years, choices that slowly shifted my life away from theirs. And as I stood there in my apartment, sunlight coming through a window that faced a parking lot instead of a landscaped backyard, I realized something else. I did not feel guilty, not the way I expected to, not the way I had been trained to feel every time I put myself first. Instead, there was this quiet steadiness, like something had finally clicked into place, and that steadiness had been built long before that night. In hours no one saw, in decisions no one noticed, because while my family thought I was just drifting, just existing in the background of their lives, I had been building something that did not depend on them at all. It started 3 years earlier, on a Tuesday night when I was sitting at this same kitchen table with a spreadsheet open and a number at the bottom that did not make sense, not because it was wrong but because it was the first time it showed me a possibility I had never seriously considered, that I could create something of my own and that it could actually work. And I remember staring at that number, refreshing the page twice just to make sure it was real, and then closing my laptop without telling anyone, because I had learned by then that announcing things too early in my family only invited doubt, criticism, or worse, indifference, so I kept it to myself and kept going. One client turned into 3 turned into 10, late nights turned into early mornings, weekends disappeared into work that no one else saw but that I tracked carefully, line by line, dollar by dollar, until the number stopped feeling like luck and started looking like structure, like something sustainable. And I did not tell them. Not when I hit my first $5,000 in a month, not when I replaced my part-time job completely, not even when I signed my first long-term contract with a company that had more employees than my father's entire department, because by then I understood something important. Their recognition was not a milestone I needed anymore. It was a ceiling I had already outgrown, and the more I built in silence, the clearer that became, which is why the anniversary invitation felt strange when it came. Not because it was unexpected, but because of the tone. My mother's message was unusually warm. We would love for you to be there, it would mean a lot. And for a moment, just a moment, I let myself wonder if something had shifted, if maybe this was their way of reaching out, of resetting, and that thought, that small flicker of hope, was enough to make me say yes, enough to make me show up in a dress I had picked out without asking anyone's opinion, enough to stand in that backyard and believe briefly that this time might be different. But what I did not realize then, what I did not see until it was already happening, was that nothing had changed on their side at all. The only thing that had changed was me, and they were about to find out the difference between the version of me they thought they still had and the one I had quietly become. By the time I got home that night, my phone had already filled with missed calls, 6 from my mother, 2 from my father, 1 from Melissa, and a string of messages that all said the same thing in different ways. Call us. We need to talk. You left in the middle of an important moment. And I stared at those notifications without opening a single one because I recognized the pattern. The urgency was never about understanding me. It was about restoring their version of control, about pulling me back into a conversation where the outcome had already been decided, and I had spent too many years participating in that cycle to pretend I did not know how it would end. So instead of responding, I opened my laptop, the same one that had sat quietly on my kitchen table for years while I built something they never thought to ask about, and I logged into an account that looked nothing like the version of me they carried in their heads. Dashboards filled with numbers, client names, contracts, timelines, everything structured, everything real. And I remember scrolling through it slowly, not because I needed to check anything but because I needed to see it with fresh eyes. To remind myself that what I had built was not temporary, not fragile, not dependent on anyone else's approval, it was mine. And that mattered more in that moment than anything they could say to me over the phone. And as I sat there, I thought about the last time I had tried to share even a small part of this with them. It was about 8 months earlier at a Sunday dinner, nothing special, just the 4 of us at the table. And I had mentioned casually that I was taking on more work, that things were picking up, and my father had nodded without really listening before saying, "That is good, as long as you remember it is not a real career." And my mother had added, "It is nice that you have something flexible, it suits you." And Melissa had smiled in that polite way she uses when she does not want to engage. And that was the moment I understood that anything I built would always be filtered through what they already believed about me, not what was actually true, and that realization had been quiet, almost easy to miss at the time, but it changed how I moved after that. It made me stop offering pieces of myself to people who had already decided how much those pieces were worth, and instead focus on building something that spoke for itself, something that did not need to be explained at a dinner table or validated in a passing comment. And now, sitting alone in my apartment with their messages still lighting up my phone, I could see the full distance between those two worlds. The one they thought I was still in and the one I had actually created. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to bridge that gap for them. I did not feel responsible for making them understand, because understanding requires willingness, and nothing about that night suggested they had any interest in seeing me differently than they always had. And that is when the decision became something more than a reaction. It became deliberate, something I chose with clarity instead of emotion. I opened my email, not theirs, but one from a name I had been expecting to hear from. A message that had arrived earlier that afternoon while I was still standing in that backyard, unnoticed, unacknowledged. And I had not opened it then because I did not want anything to distract me from what was happening in front of me. But now, in the quiet of my own space, I clicked on it, read the first line, then the second, and felt something shift again, not dramatically, not like a sudden revelation, but like a confirmation of everything I had been working toward. And I sat back in my chair, phone still buzzing beside me, and let the silence settle in once more. Because what they did not know, what they could not have imagined while they were laughing under those lights, was that I was no longer in a position where cutting them off meant losing everything. It meant stepping fully into something I had already built, something that was about to change the way they saw me whether they wanted to or not. The subject line reads simple and neutral, the kind of email that does not try to impress you because it does not need to. And for a second I just looked at it without opening it, my reflection faintly visible on the dark screen, because I knew that once I read it, there was no going back to the version of my life where I could pretend I was still waiting for my family to see me differently. So I took a breath and clicked. And the words were clear, direct, structured in a way that matched everything I had built over the past 3 years. They referenced my work, not in vague compliments but in specifics, numbers, timelines, results, things my father had always said were the only proof that mattered. And yet he had never once asked me for any of them. And as I read further, I could feel that quiet steadiness from earlier settle even deeper. Because this was not luck, this was not a one-time opportunity, this was recognition that had been earned piece by piece in hours no one had seen. And I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it register fully, because for the first time I was not imagining a different future, I was being invited into one. And the contrast between that and what had happened just hours earlier could not have been clearer. On one side, a room full of people who saw me as a joke. On the other, a message from people who had never met me in person but understood my value through the work itself. And that difference mattered more than anything my family could say at that point, because it proved something I had been slowly learning but had not fully trusted until now. That value does not come from proximity. It does not come from shared history or obligation. It comes from what you build and how you show up, consistently, even when no one is watching. And I thought about all the nights I had stayed up past midnight, all the weekends I had said no to invitations I was not excited about so I could keep working, all the times I chose progress over approval, and how invisible all of that had been to the people who claimed to know me best. And yet here it was, acknowledged in a way that felt precise, almost undeniable. And I scrolled to the bottom of the email where the offer was outlined. Not just a project, not just a short-term contract, but something larger. Something that would shift my entire schedule, my income, my location if I chose to accept it. And I remember closing my eyes for a moment, not out of hesitation but to let the clarity settle in fully, because decisions like this do not come often. And when they do, they tend to reveal more than just the next step. They reveal what you are willing to leave behind to take it. And in that moment, the messages on my phone stopped feeling urgent altogether. They felt distant, almost irrelevant. Like noise from a place I had already outgrown, and I picked up the phone not to respond but to turn it completely off because I knew that anything they said right now would only try to pull me back into a version of myself I had already walked away from. And I was not going to negotiate that decision, not this time. And as I set the phone down, I opened the email again, read through the terms once more, slower this time, more carefully, not looking for validation but for alignment, and everything matched, not just the numbers, not just the expectations, but the direction, the way it required me to step fully into the person I had been becoming in silence. And that is when it stopped feeling like a choice between two options and started feeling like a continuation of something I had already decided. And I reached for my keyboard, hovered for a second, and then began typing a response that would set everything in motion, because what they did not know, what they could not have predicted while they were reducing me to a role that fit their version of reality, was that I had already moved beyond needing their permission. And this was the moment where that became irreversible. I did not overthink the reply, and that was new for me because I used to rewrite everything 10 times before sending it, making sure it sounded right, polite enough, careful enough, never too direct, never too certain. But this time there was no hesitation. I confirmed the terms, clarified the timeline, and accepted the offer in a single response that took less than 5 minutes to write. And when I hit send, there was no dramatic feeling, no rush of emotion, just a quiet sense that something had shifted into place exactly the way it was supposed to. And I closed the laptop, stood up, and walked over to the window, looking out at the same parking lot I had seen every morning for years, except now it did not feel like a limitation. It felt temporary, like a place I had outgrown without even noticing when it happened. And that is when my phone lit up again, even though it was turned off, the screen flickering back to life as it restarted automatically after a system update I had forgotten about. And for a second I just stared at it, because timing like that almost felt intentional, like the universe was giving me one last chance to step back into the old pattern. And the messages came through all at once. My mother again. Wendy, this is not like you. My father, you embarrassed us by leaving. And then Melissa, can you just call Mom, she is upset? And I read them this time slowly, without reacting, because something about them felt smaller now, not less emotional, but less powerful, like they belonged to a version of my life that no longer had the same hold on me. And I noticed something I had never fully acknowledged before. Not one of those messages asked if I was okay. Not one of them questioned what had actually happened. They all assumed the same thing, that my role was to return, to explain, to smooth things over. And that assumption used to work on me. It used to pull me back in every single time, but now it just felt obvious, predictable in a way that made it easier to step away from. And I set the phone down again, this time without turning it off, because I did not need to block it out anymore. I just needed to stop responding, and that distinction mattered, because silence is different when it is chosen. It is not avoidance, it is control. And I realized that what I was doing was not reacting to what happened at the anniversary. It was finally breaking a pattern that had been running my entire life. And breaking a pattern like that does not happen in one moment. It happens in decisions like this, small, deliberate, repeated, until the old response no longer feels automatic. And I went back to my laptop, not to check the email again, but to open the next set of documents that had already been shared with me, onboarding materials, timelines, expectations, things that required my attention in a way that felt constructive instead of draining. And I spent the next 2 hours reading, planning, mapping out what the next few weeks would look like. And for the first time in a long time, my focus was not split between what I was building and how my family might react to it. It was fully on the work itself, and that clarity made everything easier. Decisions that used to feel heavy now felt straightforward, almost simple, because they were aligned with something real, something I had chosen. And when I finally closed my laptop again, the light outside had shifted, late afternoon moving into evening, and my phone had gone quiet. No new messages, no missed calls, just stillness. And I picked it up, unlocked it, and opened my contacts, not to call them, but to look at the names I had been carrying for so long. Robert, Linda, Melissa, and I hovered there for a moment, not out of doubt but out of recognition, because this was the point where things became real in a different way, not just internally but externally, and I knew that once I took the next step, there would be no version of this where I could casually return, no easy way back into the role they had for me. And for a second I let that reality sit, not as something to fear but as something to respect, because walking away from something familiar, even when it is harmful, still requires a kind of clarity most people avoid. And then I made the simplest move of all. I changed nothing in the contacts. I did not block them, I did not delete anything, I just closed the app, set the phone down, and continued with my evening, because what they did not understand yet, what they would only realize later, was that I was no longer playing a role that needed to react to them at all. I had already stepped into something else entirely. The next morning felt different in a way I could not immediately explain. Not because anything external had changed, the same light came through the same window, the same quiet filled the apartment, but internally there was no hesitation about what came next, and that absence of hesitation made everything move faster, cleaner, more intentional. I woke up before my alarm, reached for my laptop instead of my phone, and opened the onboarding portal that had been waiting for me. A structured system, with clear steps, deadlines, expectations, everything laid out in a way that felt almost unfamiliar because I was used to guessing what people wanted from me, adjusting in real time, reading between lines that were never clearly stated. But here there was no guessing, just execution, and I moved through the first set of tasks methodically, uploading documents, confirming details, aligning timelines, and with each step I completed, the distance between where I had been and where I was going became more defined, more real, and it was not just about the work itself, it was about what the work required from me, a level of ownership I had been practicing quietly for years but had never been asked to demonstrate this openly, and that shift mattered because when someone expects you to show up fully, you stop negotiating with yourself about whether you are ready, you either step into it or you do not, and I had already made that decision the night before, even if I had not fully processed it yet. And as I continued through the process, I noticed something else. I was not thinking about my family at all, not about what they would say, not about how they would react, not even about whether they would eventually understand, and that absence was not forced, it was natural, like my attention had finally found something that deserved it more. And around mid-morning my phone buzzed again, a new message, this time longer than the others, and I glanced at it without picking it up, my mother's name still at the top, and I could see just enough of the preview to recognize the tone, a mix of frustration and expectation, the kind of message that tries to pull you back in by making you feel responsible for the tension. And for a brief moment I felt the old reflex, the urge to respond, to clarify, to explain myself in a way that would make everything smoother, but it passed almost immediately, replaced by something steadier. Something that did not need to justify itself, and I let the phone sit there, unanswered, while I turned back to my screen and kept moving forward, because this was the part that mattered now, not the conversation they wanted to have, but the one I was having with my own future. And by early afternoon I had completed more in a few hours than I usually would in an entire day, not because I was rushing but because I was focused, fully aligned with what I was doing, and that kind of focus is hard to describe if you have never felt it. It is not pressure, it is not urgency, it is clarity, the kind that removes distractions instead of adding them. And when I finally stepped away from my desk, stretching slightly, walking back toward the kitchen, I caught my reflection again in the glass of the microwave, and for a second I paused, not because anything about me had physically changed, but because the way I saw myself had, and that shift was subtle but undeniable. I was no longer the person waiting to be recognized, I was the one deciding what recognition meant, and that difference was going to change more than just my work. It was going to change every interaction that followed, including the ones I had not had yet, because what they did not realize, what they could not see from where they were still standing, was that I was not just ignoring them, I was moving into a position where their version of me no longer applied at all, and once that happens, everything they thought they understood starts to fall apart. It happened on the third day, not in some dramatic way, not with a confrontation or a sudden realization, but with something small that should have been easy to ignore, a notification from a number I did not recognize, and I almost dismissed it without opening it, assuming it was just another attempt to reach me through a different route, but something about the timing made me pause, and when I tapped on it the message was short, direct, and completely different from anything I had been receiving. Hi Wendy, this is Karen from Northbridge Group, just confirming we are aligned for the kickoff call tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern. And I stared at it for a second, not because I was confused, but because of how normal it felt, how professional, how focused on something real instead of something emotional. And I replied within seconds, confirming the time, confirming my availability, confirming my readiness, and that exchange, simple as it was, felt like a line being drawn, not between me and my family, but between two completely different versions of my life, One built on reacting to expectations I never agreed to, and one built on stepping into opportunities one had created myself. And as the day moved forward, everything continued in that same direction: structured calls, detailed discussions, clear expectations, people who listened when I spoke and responded to what I actually said instead of what they assumed about me. And that difference was not subtle, it was immediate, almost disorienting at first, because I was so used to being overlooked that being taken seriously felt unfamiliar, like learning a new language you did not realize you needed. And during that first call, when they asked for my input on a decision that would impact the next phase of the project, I noticed something shift again, not in them but in me. I did not hesitate. I did not soften my response or frame it in a way that made it easier to accept. I answered directly, clearly, based on what I knew and what I had built, and they did not question it. They incorporated it, adjusted the plan, moved forward, and that moment, small as it might seem, carried more weight than anything that had happened at that anniversary, because it confirmed that the way I saw myself now was not just internal. It translated into the world outside in a way that could not be dismissed. And when the call ended, I sat there for a second, letting that sink in, because for the first time, I was not trying to prove my value, I was operating from it, and that changes everything. It changes how people respond to you, how opportunities present themselves, how you make decisions, and most importantly, how you see the people who never saw you that way. And later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again, another message from my mother, longer this time, more urgent, and I could feel the shift in tone even before I opened it, less controlled, more emotional, and for a moment, I considered reading it, not to respond but to understand what had changed on their side. But then I stopped because I realized something important. I did not need to monitor their reactions anymore to move forward. I did not need to track their emotions or anticipate their responses. That was part of the old pattern, the one I had already stepped out of. And instead of opening the message, I turned the phone face down and went back to my work, because this was where my attention belonged now, not in trying to manage how they felt about me, but in continuing to build something that made their opinions irrelevant. And as the evening settled in, quieter than the nights before but somehow fuller, I understood something that would have felt impossible just a week earlier. I was no longer waiting for a moment where everything would finally make sense between us. I had already moved past the point where that mattered. And what they did not realize yet, what they would only begin to understand when the silence stretched longer than they expected, was that I was not taking space to come back. I was creating distance that I had no intention of closing. By the end of the first week, the silence from my family stopped feeling temporary and started feeling intentional. Not on their side but on mine, because I had not broken it once, not with a reply, not with a reaction, not even with a moment of curiosity strong enough to pull me back into their orbit. And that consistency changed something. It made the distance real in a way that could not be explained away as me being busy or distracted. And I knew they would feel that difference even if they did not understand it yet, because for years I had always come back, always responded, always made sure the connection stayed intact no matter how one-sided it was. And now, that pattern was gone completely, and patterns like that leave a gap when they disappear, a space that forces people to notice what used to fill it. And I could almost picture the conversations happening without me, my mother trying to make sense of it, my father framing it as disrespect, Melissa staying quiet the way she always did when things became uncomfortable, and that image used to pull me back in, used to make me feel responsible for fixing whatever tension was building. But now it just felt distant, like watching a scene I was no longer part of. And instead of stepping into it, I stayed where I was, focused on what was in front of me, because that was where everything was changing, not in some dramatic overnight transformation, but in a series of steady, deliberate steps that built on each other. And by Friday, the first phase of the project was already moving faster than expected, timelines tightening, responsibilities expanding, and I was no longer easing into it. I was fully inside it, making decisions, leading discussions, setting direction in ways I had never been allowed to do in my own family. And the contrast was impossible to ignore. In one space I had been reduced to a role that required me to shrink. In another I was being asked to expand, to take ownership, to trust my own judgment without filtering it through someone else's expectations. And that shift did not just affect how I worked, it affected how I thought about everything, including what had happened at that anniversary, because the more I stepped into this new space, the clearer it became that what they had done was not an isolated moment. It was a reflection of a structure I had already outgrown. And once you outgrow something like that, going back does not feel like comfort, it feels like regression. And that realization removed the last piece of doubt I did not even realize I was still carrying. And late that afternoon, as I was reviewing a set of documents that outlined the next stage of the partnership, my phone rang again, not a message this time but a call. My mother's name lighting up the screen in a way that would have stopped me in the middle of anything just a week earlier. And I looked at it without reaching for it, letting it ring, not out of hesitation but out of certainty, because I already knew what that call represented. Not a new conversation, not a different outcome, just another attempt to pull me back into a role I had already left. And when it stopped, a voicemail followed almost immediately, the notification appearing at the top of my screen, and for a second I considered listening to it. Not because I needed to, but because it felt like the final piece of something I had been closing, and I tapped on it, pressed play, and heard her voice, softer than before, less controlled, more uncertain. Wendy, I do not understand what is happening. This is not how we handle things. Call me back. And I listened to the entire message without interrupting it, without reacting to it, and when it ended I set the phone down again, not with frustration, not with anger, but with clarity, because what she said was true in one way. This was not how we handled things before. But that was exactly the point. I was no longer handling things the way we always had. I was doing something different, something that did not revolve around maintaining a system that had never valued me. And that difference was not something I needed to explain. It was something they would have to observe over time, through absence, through silence, through the reality that I was not coming back to reset things the way they expected. And as I returned to my work, the document still open in front of me, I realized something else. This was not just about walking away from them. It was about stepping fully into a life that no longer had space for that version of me at all. And what they did not know yet, what they would only begin to understand when the silence stretched into something permanent, was that this was not a pause, it was a complete shift, one that would eventually force them to see me in a way they never had before, whether they wanted to or not. The second week began with a shift that was subtle on the surface but impossible to ignore once you felt it, the kind of shift that happens when something moves from potential into reality. And I noticed it the moment I joined the Monday morning call, not because anyone said anything dramatic, but because of how they introduced me, not as someone assisting, not as someone observing, but as someone leading a key part of the project. And I heard my name followed by words that would have sounded exaggerated coming from anyone in my family, but here they were stated plainly, without hesitation, without qualification, and for a brief second I almost questioned it, not because it was untrue, but because I was not used to hearing myself described that way out loud. And then the call moved forward, discussions unfolding, decisions being made, and I stepped into it fully, not overthinking, not holding back, just responding to what was in front of me with the same clarity I had been building in private for years. And as the conversation progressed, I could feel the difference in how people responded. They did not talk over me, they did not redirect the conversation away from my input, they built on it, referenced it, used it to shape the next steps. And that kind of interaction does something to you. It reinforces something internally that no amount of self-talk can replicate, because it is not just belief, it is confirmation. And when the call ended, I did not sit there replaying what I should have said differently. I closed the meeting notes, updated the timeline, and moved on, because there was nothing to fix, nothing to adjust, and that was new. And later that afternoon an email came through summarizing the call, outlining responsibilities, assigning ownership, and my name was there again, not in a supporting role, not as a backup, but at the center of a section that would determine the direction of the next phase. And I read through it carefully, not out of doubt, but out of respect for what it represented, because this was no longer something I was building quietly on the side. It was something visible, structured, acknowledged in a way that could not be dismissed or minimized. And as I closed the email, I realized that the distance between me and my family had expanded even further, not because I had done anything new in relation to them, but because I had moved forward in a way that made going back less and less possible. And that realization came with a kind of calm that felt different from anything I had experienced before. Not relief, not excitement, just certainty. And that certainty made everything else easier, including the moment that came later that evening when my phone lit up again, this time with a message from Melissa, longer than usual, more direct. Wendy, this has gone too far. Mom is really upset. Dad is saying things are getting out of hand. Can you please just talk to us? And I read it once, then again, not because I was trying to decode it, but because I wanted to see if anything about it felt different from the pattern I had already recognized. And it did not. It was still framed around their reaction, their discomfort, their need for things to return to what they considered normal. And for the first time I saw that clearly, without feeling pulled into it, without feeling responsible for resolving it. And I set the phone down without replying, not as a statement, not as a punishment, just as a continuation of the decision I had already made. And I went back to my laptop, to the work that was now shaping my days in a way that felt aligned instead of draining. And as the evening settled in, I found myself thinking not about what I had left behind, but about what was ahead, the meetings scheduled, the milestones approaching, the possibilities that were now within reach, not because someone had given them to me, but because I had built toward them step by step, quietly, consistently. And that perspective changed everything, because it meant that what happened at that anniversary was no longer the defining moment of my story. It was just the last moment before everything shifted, and what they did not understand yet, what they were still trying to fix through messages and calls and expectations, was that there was nothing left to fix on my side. I had already moved on in a way that did not require their agreement, their approval, or their understanding at all. It was toward the end of the second week when something shifted again, not in my work this time, but in how the outside world started reflecting it back to me in ways I had not planned for, and I noticed it in a small but undeniable moment. An email forwarded to me by Karen with a short note at the top, "Thought you should see this," and when I opened it, it was from someone I had never spoken to directly, a senior executive on their side of the partnership, referencing a report I had put together 3 days earlier, and the message was concise, focused, but the language stood out not because it was overly complimentary, but because it was specific. It highlighted decisions I had made, insights I had contributed, outcomes that were already taking shape because of them, and I read through it once, then again, not because I needed to confirm it was real, but because I wanted to fully register what it meant. And as I sat there, I realized this was the kind of recognition my father always talked about, the kind that came from results, from measurable impact, from something that could not be dismissed as subjective or emotional. And yet this was happening in a space he had never even asked about, and that contrast settled in quietly, not as frustration, not as anger, but as something clearer, something that made it easier to understand why nothing he said about me had ever matched who I actually was becoming, because he had never been looking in the right place. And for a moment, I thought about what it would look like if he saw this, if he read those same words, if he had to reconcile them with the version of me he had presented to a room full of people just 2 weeks earlier. And that thought lingered longer than I expected, not because I wanted to prove anything to him, but because it revealed something about the gap between perception and reality that had defined my entire role in that family. And then my phone rang again, interrupting that thought, my father's name this time, and I watched it light up. The screen steady, insistent, and for a second I did not move, not because I was considering answering, but because I recognized the timing, the way this always happened. Just as things started to move forward for me, just as something real began to take shape, there would be a pull from the other side, a call, a message, an expectation that I step back into the role they understood. And I let it ring just like before, but this time something felt different, not in the action but in the weight of it, because I realized that each time I chose not to answer, the distance was no longer just emotional, it was structural. It was redefining the relationship in a way that could not be undone by a single conversation later. And when the call stopped, a message followed almost immediately, shorter than the others, more direct. "We need to talk, this has gone too far." And I read it once, then set the phone down without responding, not out of defiance, not out of anger, but because there was nothing in that message that required a reply from me. It was still centered on their perspective, their definition of what was acceptable, their expectation that I would return to adjust myself to fit it, and that expectation no longer aligned with anything in my life now. And I turned back to my laptop, to the work that was continuing to expand in front of me, timelines evolving, responsibilities increasing, and I realized that the more I moved forward, the less relevant those messages became, not because they stopped coming, but because they no longer had any influence over what I was building. And that shift, subtle but absolute, marked something important, not just the end of a pattern, but the beginning of a new one, one where my actions were no longer shaped by how my family saw me, but by what I knew I was capable of and what they did not understand yet. What they were still trying to reach through calls and messages and expectations was that I was no longer standing in a place where their version of me could reach at all. It was exactly 14 days after that night when everything converged in a way I could not have planned, not because I had been waiting for it, but because it arrived on its own timeline, and I saw it first in an email notification that came through early in the morning, subject line simple, direct, but carrying more weight than anything I had received before. And as I opened it, I realized this was not just another update, not just another step forward. This was a formal confirmation, the kind that moved everything from active work into something publicly acknowledged, documented, something that could not be minimized or reframed by anyone outside of it. And I read through it carefully, each line reinforcing what had already been building, the scope, the recognition, the role I was now officially stepping into. And I sat there for a moment after finishing, not reacting immediately, just letting the reality of it settle in fully. Because this was the point where everything became visible beyond the small circle I had been working within, and visibility changes things. It shifts how people perceive you, how they talk about you, how your name moves through spaces you are not physically in. And I knew that shift would not stay contained for long, not in a world where information travels faster than intention. And I closed my laptop, stood up, and walked to the window again, the same one that had framed so many quiet moments over the past years, except now it reflected something different back at me. Not a version of myself waiting, not someone building in the background, but someone who had already crossed into something. Established something real, and as I stood there my phone lit up again, but this time it was not a call or a message from my family, it was a notification from a professional platform, a post I had been tagged in, and when I opened it I saw my name there clearly publicly attached to the work, the project, the outcome, and the comments below it were from people I did not know personally but who understood exactly what it represented, who recognized the impact without needing any explanation, and I scrolled through it slowly, not because I needed validation but because I understood what this meant in a broader sense. This was no longer something that could be contained within my own space. It had moved into the public, into a level of visibility that would inevitably reach places I had not directly connected it to. And almost as if on cue my phone rang again, my mother's name appearing on the screen, and this time I did not even consider answering, not out of resistance, not out of emotion, but because I already knew that whatever they had to say now was no longer aligned with where I was standing, and the call ended, followed by another message, longer than before, more urgent, but I did not open it, not immediately. I set the phone down and let it sit there while I returned to my laptop, to the email, to the confirmation that had just arrived, because that was the reality I was operating in now, not the one they were still trying to pull me back into. And when I finally picked up the phone again, it was not to respond but simply to look at the message to see how the tone had shifted. And even without opening it fully I could tell it had changed, less certain, less controlled, more reactive, and I realized something in that moment that settled everything completely. They were no longer responding to the version of me they thought they had defined, they were reacting to something they did not understand, something they had not anticipated, and that difference meant the balance had already shifted, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet, undeniable one, and what they did not know, what they could not have seen coming from where they stood that night under those lights, was that the moment they tried to define me publicly was the same moment I had already outgrown their definition entirely. 2 days later I saw them again, not in person, not face to face, but in a way that made everything come full circle without me having to step back into their world, because the post I had been tagged in kept spreading, shared across networks I had never even been part of, picked up by people who cared about results, not family narratives, and somewhere along that chain it reached someone who knew my father, someone who recognized the last name, the connection, and decided to pass it along. And I did not know that in the moment. I only found out later when the pattern shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. The call stopped, the messages changed, the urgency faded into something else, something quieter, more cautious, and for the first time since that night there was a pause on their side, not because they understood everything, but because they realized there was something they had missed, something they could no longer define on their own terms. And that realization did not come from anything I said, because I had said nothing. It came from what I had built, from what had become visible without my involvement, and that is what changed the balance completely, because when perception is challenged by reality, especially in a public way, it forces a kind of recalibration that words alone can never achieve. And a week after that, I received a message from Melissa, different from the others, not longer, not more emotional, just different in tone. I saw the post I did not know, and I read it once, then again, not because I needed to analyze it, but because I recognized what it represented, not an apology, not an explanation, but a shift, a small one but real. And I did not respond, not immediately, because this was not about correcting their understanding piece by piece. This was about allowing them to see the full picture over time without me stepping in to manage it. And I set the phone down and went back to my work, because that was still where everything was anchored, the meetings, the deadlines, the responsibilities that now filled my days in a way that felt complete. And as the weeks continued, that sense of completion only grew stronger, not because everything was perfect, but because it was aligned, consistent, built on something I controlled instead of something I had to adjust to. And one evening, as I closed my laptop after a long but productive day, I realized something that settled everything completely. I was no longer thinking about whether they would ever understand me. I was no longer waiting for a moment where things would be resolved between us, because resolution requires two people standing in the same place, and I was not there anymore. I had moved on fully into a life that did not depend on their recognition to exist, and that did not mean I was angry. It did not mean I was trying to prove anything. It simply meant I had accepted something that had been true for a long time, that the version of me they had defined was never the full picture, and now for the first time I was living entirely outside of that definition, and the silence between us, the space that had once felt heavy and complicated, now felt clear, intentional, and final in a way that did not need to be announced, because it was already understood through everything that had happened. And as I stood there, looking out at the same window that had framed the beginning of all of this, I realized that the night they tried to reduce me to something small in front of everyone was not the moment I lost my place in that family. It was the moment I stepped out of it completely, and what they did not know then, what they only began to understand later, was that I did not leave because I was hurt. I left because I had finally outgrown a version of myself that no longer existed.